I will now introduce our first speaker, Professor Christopher Reed. Christopher Reed is Emeritus Professor of European History at the University of Warwik. He obtained his PhD at the London School of Economics. He has written on a wide range of topics in Russian cultural, social, and political history in the revolutionary period. He has published 2 books this year, namely Lenin Lives, Oxford UP, and The Russian Intelligentsia from the Monastery to the Mir Space Station, Bloomsbury. In connection with today's topic, he has written biographies of Lenin, Lenin, A Revolutionary Life, Routledge 2002, and Stalin, Stalin, From the Caucasus to the Kremlin, Routledge 2017. See also Russia and in War and Revolution. Chris, the word, you can start. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for the great honor of inviting me to talk to you. And thank you to Monica and Virginia and Elisa for all the preparations and everything. And I have been looking forward to this event. It's a very wide topic, of course, and there's so many things one could do to commemorate Lenin, to think about Lenin. The book that Virginia just mentioned, let me just emphasize, it's Lenin Lives ? And that was one of the issues. Is Lenin still a viable sort of presence today? Clearly, he's a great presence in the past. But the idea of whether what he has to contribute, if anything, to modern debates about modern society is very debatable, very questionable. So in order to try to focus a little bit on some of these issues without getting lost in something which is too broad and too vacuous, I'd like to comment on a number of aspects of Lenin's life and career that, to me, have not always carried the weight they should in discussions about him. I could perhaps begin by just making 1 or 2 personal points about my own interactions with Lenin, in the sense that by inclination, I am primarily a structuralist historian. I always tended to see the shapes of society, the shaping forces of society as being more important than individuals. It's an irony, of course, that Marx and the Marxist tradition and other traditions have tended to argue in those terms. But Soviet history turned out to have a little bit of a joke for us, really, because it was really the individuals involved in Soviet history, from Lenin to Stalin to Khrushchev to Brezhnev to Gorbachev, were absolutely crucial in the shape and direction of history. So I don't want to deny the agency of individuals, and certainly not of people like Lenin. But it was a little bit of a surprise to me when the publisher said, well, would you like to write a biography of Lenin? And it had never occurred to me before, simply because, well, there were many biographies of Lenin at the time, and they had seemed to have covered the ground. But then I thought, oh, well, maybe there are certain aspects that are not very well covered by that. And in any case, I had this feeling that I was already, 20, 30 years into my career, I suppose, when that started. I'd already spent a lot of time living with Lenin. So I felt as though I knew who Lenin was, I knew his character, and I knew seemed to me to have a particular kind of personality, set of values, which was not reflected necessarily at the time. It was a view which didn't fit the prevailing stereotypes of most of my early years studying the subject, which of course were very much shaped by the Cold War on both sides. And curiously, there were certain features in common on both sides of the Cold War. Both considered Lenin's agency to be extremely strong, one in order to attack it and argue that it was malign, and his supporters to point out his heroic genius. I'll mention this a little bit later on, but it seemed to me that neither of these was true, and maybe we'd even over-exaggerated Lenin's agency, but let's think about that in a moment or two. But it was already now 2000, around the year 2000 when this came up, and the time seemed ripe, given the collapse of Lenin's main project, although one of my friends criticized me for calling it his project, the Soviet Union and the Soviet Communist Party. And that after 1991, we began to look at Lenin in a different way. So the time is right for a kind of new look at Lenin's work and ideas. And I was struck by a phrase which came from Lars Lee around that time, slightly later, where he said it was time to look for the historical Lenin. And I thought, yes, that's precisely right. We need to try and extract Lenin from underneath the great dead weight of polemical argument on both sides and see what we get, what kind of emerges. So that's kind of what I've been trying to do as far as Lenin is concerned since that time. The collapse of the Soviet Union, I should perhaps add, is the last of my kind of personal comments. It seemed to me at the time that it could only be beneficial to the left that the Soviet Union and Soviet communism had been undermined and basically removed, because it's in that period, debate about socialism, Marxism, radicalism, any kind of progressism led to the opponent shouting, "Oh, well, go and live in Moscow if you want," or "What do you like Moscow?" Whatever. And I thought that now that we didn't have that albatross around our necks, it would liberate a wider degree of discussion. Little did I know, of course, that in fact it has not actually had that effect at all, really. The left has, I'm not au fait with the latest in Italian politics, but from what I gather there and everywhere else, the left is no longer a kind of force at all in the way that it was even in 1990, 2000. And to my surprise, in a way, the existence of the Soviet Union underpinned the survival of the left, because in a way it was the only major challenge in the European Atlantic world, which stood up against the forces of capitalism, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, forces of conservatism. So in fact, we've got ourselves into a bigger mess. I'm not going to talk about the terrible situation that we have in Europe and the war in Ukraine, except that it's hardly believable. I mean, I find it incredible. I mean, I spent my life trying to, if this doesn't sound too pious, try to create some kind of rapprochement between East and West to try to reduce the hostility of East and West. Today, it's at its worst. It's 10 times stronger than it was in the Cold War, and it's 10 times closer to the disaster of a war between both sides, possibly even a nuclear war. So you can't, as historians, we look at the past, we are not very good at telling the future, and hopefully the future will come to surprise us in a good way. So around the turn of the century, I think the time is ripe for new approaches to Lenin. I'm obviously not going to follow all of these up, but I would like to remark on some of them with a view to stimulating a degree of discussion in your conference. Not that you need it, because you've got some great speakers and some great topics coming up anyway, but I'll do my best. First, obviously, and I think something which everybody can agree on, Lenin, in terms of his political actions, his practice, his praxis, as it was used to be talked about in the 60s, was massively influential in his time and continued to be so, obviously, for several generations afterwards. And the question that I mentioned briefly earlier is still considered to be true. However, one issue which I think is interesting to focus on is that his ideas also have a degree of force and are turned to for guidance even today by people on the left. And his ideas and theories still engage many people. But I'd want to raise this question. If Lenin had not, excuse me, I speak up a cold earlier in the week. If Lenin had not taken power and become the leader of the largest entity on the planet, would we read his theory? Would we read his ideas? Would we talk about his philosophies? Is he an outstanding thinker as well as being an outstanding practitioner? And I'm not quite so convinced about that. I think in many ways we could kind of separate his activities from his ideas. If he was purely a thinker and the Russian Revolution failed and Lenin had been arrested on his way to the Tauride Palace on the 24th as he was going to the Soviet in the middle of the revolution, and we never basically heard of him in October in the way we saw it never happened, we would read Lenin. Of course we would read Lenin the same way that we read a number of thinkers of the time: Luxemburg, Bogdanov, Bukharin, Gramsci. I think Gramsci's, in my view, probably more accomplished as a thinker than Lenin himself is, and Trotsky, of course, and many other great radical thinkers. But by and large, they would only be read by disciples, the same as it is today. I mean, who reads Bukharin? Nobody much, unless they're really into the subject, or as historians, or whatever else. People don't look at Bukharin for guidance in the modern world. Although, in fact, curiously, I have a feeling that both the Russian economy and Russia and China are running economies which are actually closer to Soviet NIP of a form of state capitalism than they are to pure capitalism or to pure socialism. So maybe Bukharin does have something to tell us, but that's an aside. I wasn't intending to move into that direction. But I don't see Lenin as a great philosopher and thinker if you detach it from his practice. I don't know how many of you have actually read, and be honest here, from cover to cover, if at all, Lenin's Materialism and Empirio-Criticism. I don't think I run into many people who tell me, oh, what Lenin said in Materialism was this, that, or the other. I started out, it's one of the first things I really studied of Lenin's, because my PhD was on the debate around Viechi in 1909, and not because I was a supporter of Viechi, although they had some very interesting things to say, but because it actually was a wonderful way of charting the opinions of all different groups, including Lenin, who reacted to the philosophical and ideological challenges of the time with this really very narrow piece of polemic, in which he describes people who don't agree with him as idiots and fools, and the usual Leninist imprecations, not particularly philosophical language. And the basic content of it is also fairly naive from the political point of view. I don't think the philosophical attention of the 20th century has ever been much drawn to reading Lenin's Materialism and Empirio-Criticism. But of course, the fusing of ideas and practice is a different thing altogether, because that's where Lenin's, to me, where Lenin's strength lies. I think we sometimes overlook the fact that all his works, I mean, obviously with his newspaper articles, with his interventions at conferences, with his speeches, it's obvious that Lenin is simply talking to the moment. But in fact, most of his major works are also occasional pieces, meaning, of course, they're written for particular occasions. And they're deeply entrenched in the arguments and the debates of the particular time in which he writes them. This goes right back to the beginning. The development of capitalism in Russia is a very interesting piece of work, and Lenin was, maybe I'll come back to this, a very acute observer of conjunctures and of things around him. He's a very accomplished political analyst. But development of capitalism in Russia has, like all the others, most of the others, an ideological subtext. The subtext is the populists were wrong. The subtext of almost everything Lenin wrote in those early stages was the populists are wrong, because he was busy defining social democracy as being not populism. Although, as I said in my book, Lenin personally has all the instincts and respects the early populist, and in many respects is himself a populist. But I don't want to. I'm not planning to. I can discuss that if you want to in questions, but I'm not planning to return to that direction. But in development of capitalism in Russia, he is saying, hold on, folks, you can't do what the populists say and avoid capitalism. It's too late. It's here. We're already in the capitalist stage. It's early, but it's the capitalist stage. So we, deal with it. So it's not simply an academic enterprise in analyzing the Russian economy. It's a political polemic, and so it goes on. I mean, the one which is most obviously political polemic is what is to be done, because it's deeply entrenched in the redefinition of the party. And I tended to share Lars Lee's view, and I wrote in my biography that Lenin was not actually being that innovative when he wrote What Is to Be Done. And of course, initially it was accepted by the greats of the party as a major contribution to party thinking, until Lenin began to develop his Monty Python style tendency to splitism of various kinds, and that changed people's perceptions not only of Lenin but also of his works. And I think what Lenin was arguing for in What Is to Be Done was not a party of a new type, a conspiratorial party. He said in many ways that's crucial in Russia, and he actually says at one point, we need this because in Russia, everything, if we work openly, we're going to be attacked by the police. It was not intended to be a generalized form of a socialist political movement or socialist political party. It was specifically Russian, and yet it became glorified later as a sort of universal model, to the great detriment, I think, in many ways, of Comintern and of international revolution. That's yet another question of immense implications that we can't really go into in the space of what we have today. If I jump from there to his work on imperialism, imperialism is perhaps the work which is most widely used still today by a lot of people who are not necessarily Leninists, as a theory of imperialism. And in many respects, of course, it is. But again, what Lenin was trying to do in imperialism was to establish the case for the legitimacy of a Marxist revolution in a country like Russia. Because, as everybody knew, and again in his polemics with the economists and the populists, he'd been the Bolsheviks, and it doesn't exactly fit into Bolsheviks versus Mensheviks, so that's the way history has really stuck it together. But those who believed that Russia could have a socialist revolution of a Marxist kind, and those who didn't, and thought Russia should wait for capitalism to evolve, because for Marx, socialist revolution came at the highest point of capitalist development, and Russia was hardly through the front door of capitalism as far as it was concerned for itself. But imperialism says, well, hold on a bit. Capitalism is a world system. And we can play a part in that. He borrowed Bukharin and Bogdanov's phrase that capitalism, the chain of capitalism, would break at its weakest link. And Russia was one of its weak links. So Lenin concludes from his views on imperialism that, yeah, we can start an anti-capitalist revolution here. But of course, his logical position and his actual position when he came to power, theoretically at least, was we can't conclude it. It has to spread. We have to have an international revolution. We can't survive as a socialist revolution in one country. Although, if I have time, I'll come back to say another couple of words about that in a slightly different light. So and so it goes on. State and Revolution. Now, State and Revolution is also a widely read text, and a very interesting text, and a great model, one would have thought, for socialist revolution. My problem with State and Revolution is it has absolutely nothing to do with Lenin's practice. He didn't operate in the way that he says the Soviets should operate. That they should take over the country. They should become the administrators. A post-socialist country should be run like the German post office by routine people who can do basic arithmetic. That just doesn't happen in Russia, and yet State and Revolution is still held up as a great model. As I said, it's a fascinating piece of work, and I think in many ways is still quite stimulating. But it's not what Lenin did, which raises another problem that I'm going to mention in a moment. Then finally, his last writings on cooperation, better, fewer but better, our revolution, his response to Sukhanov, is also basically polemical, because he's arguing that, or he's facing the point that the Mensheviks, who told us we couldn't seize power because Russia wasn't ready, but who says we seize power from above? And he basically says we're now going to have to create the preconditions that should have been there to bring us to power in the first place. And of course, that led to the Soviet Union being a curious entity based more than anything else on productionism, based on the theoretical fact that it had to create the conditions which should have brought it into existence. It came into existence ahead of the conditions that were right for it. So unless there was an economy of abundance, which Marx sees as a basic necessity for socialism, you can't have socialism. You can't have a socialism of scarcity. It becomes extremely authoritarian, and we've seen that in practice, of course, in many countries. So Lenin's very much a person with whom theory and practice come very, very closely together. In more recently reflecting, going back on Lenin's ideas for the Lenin Lives project, it also occurred to me, I mean, it's staring me in the face. It's one of these things that stares you in the face, but you don't actually really absorb it, which was that as for most people up until obviously till 1956, Leninism was actually Stalinism. There was you couldn't put a piece of paper between them for anybody but the dissenting group of Trotskyists. It was Stalin who defined Leninism. I have a photograph in my book in Lenin Lives. I quite like the photographs, actually. You can just look at the pictures and you'll get the whole story, I think. Starts with the photograph of the famous photograph of the Ulyanov family when Lenin was still a boy, and with his brothers and sisters and parents, looking at the very epitome of a 19th century bourgeois family, and ends with the photograph of three Marx, Lenin and Stalin impersonators in Red Square selling their image for tourists to take photographs with Lenin, which seemed to me quite a interesting way to finish the story. But there is a photograph in there of Stalin at Lenin's funeral with the open coffin, carrying it with Trotsky and Zinoviev and Bukharin. Trotsky famously absent, but not through any malevolence, it seems. But and I said, this is the moment that Lenin dies. It's the moment that Leninism is born, because there was no Leninism in Lenin's day. Lenin detested the idea of going back to his former writings, or people quoting him, or people seeing him as some kind of universal guru. And according to Borch-Borevich, it was only when he suggested that some of Lenin's early writings be republished, Lenin said, "What on earth people want to read that old rubbish for?" That's what is to be done, and it's like that he was talking about. And Borch-Borevich says, "Well, if you don't do it, the Mensheviks are publishing theirs." So, "Oh, well, we'll do it. Yes, okay, we'll do it." But he wasn't very keen on seeing himself in that light, whereas it was Stalin who codified Leninism, who codified so many of the aspects of it, codified the notion which people, perhaps one of those which they most deeply associate with Lenin is the idea of the party. And the idea of the party is basically a Stalinist idea of the party, a highly disciplined, centralized party, with authority flowing from basically top to bottom, and then a form of democratic centralism, which is more central than democratic. Lenin's party, in practice, didn't resemble that in any way whatsoever. Lenin's party was undisciplined. It was full of people with different ideas. By 1921, they were getting to the point of getting exasperated and trying to, and by banning factions, and the 10th Party Congress is a very important turning point in this respect. But up until then, and on into the 20s, the Communist Party didn't resemble a centralized organization at all. It had many different factions, many different groups. People fought against each other. People had different ideas and very different interpretations of key policies, and so on and so forth. So it was more like a fairly regular political party, full of divisions, full of debates. And it's certainly, well, I'll come back to this again in a moment, another thing to come back to. But Lenin, in many ways, did not come to power by Leninist principles. So writing Lenin Lives, ? Brought a number of these issues back into focus. And in addition to the ones that I've been talking about already, there were 2 or 3 more, which I think are probably worth considering. I started by saying that Lenin's leadership was taken for granted as a key factor by his allies and by his enemies. It was the one thing they had in common. And this continued in an interesting book for the centenary, which many people piled in on, centenary of the revolution, I mean, in 2017. Tariq Ali said, one thing we can be certain, without Lenin, there would have been no October Revolution. Well, actually, he's wrong. There would have been an October Revolution, but it wouldn't have been the October Revolution we know. Lenin is very important in defining that. But the idea of Lenin's leadership of that revolution, particularly before October, I mean, it doesn't bear a moment of examination, really. Lenin wasn't even there most of the time. He was out of Russia from 1899 to late 1905, and from 1908 through to the Finland station in April 1917. And then he was in Finland in hiding from July right the way through to October. So how was he able to lead from a safe house in Helsinki. Where did that leadership come from? Leadership of what? Certainly he was influential in the leadership of the party. But even so, we've known for many years that when Lenin was urging seizure of power from his safe house in September 1917, the reaction of the Central Committee and his associates was, Lenin's got a bit over the top here. He doesn't really know what's happening. He's stuck in Helsinki. Let's burn his letters in case the police find them. No indication that they're going to work on them. And that argument has been made many times before, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But his projection from obscurity to power is absolutely breathtaking. And seeing it as somehow inevitable, a step-by-step process from what is to be done to 1905, to 1914, to 1917, just belies the facts. I mean, at the beginning of 1917, hardly anybody would know who Lenin was outside the small political circles of Petrograd. And even after 1917, there are lots of good anecdotes about how Lenin wasn't recognized by people. His facial or whatever recognition was minimal. But he was projected from this position of obscurity and a complete lack of any experience of government into controlling the largest administrative space on the planet within a matter of 6 weeks, basically. So I think that's something which we need to bear in mind, and that rise is hard to equate with what were seen or have become seen as his revolutionary methods. It was not an organized party leading a militant group of workers. It was not a planned event in any meaningful sense. It was a brilliant opportunistic action from Lenin's point of view. People ask if October was a coup or a revolution. Well, I've come to the conclusion, I don't know how many people will agree with me, but it's both. It's clearly a revolution because the peasantry are seizing land, the workers are seizing factories. There is a massive spontaneous revolution going on. And that is deeply ingrained in Russian society. The coup comes because Lenin establishes his flag at the head of it. Peace, bread, land, all power to the Soviets. 4 slogans, which meant one thing to Lenin and something quite different to everybody else. Again, an issue that we can pick up in questions, but it's been talked about quite a lot before, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But Lenin established himself in the leadership of a revolution he didn't sympathize with. He didn't believe in the workers' demands. He didn't believe in giving the peasants land as the ultimate form of socialism. These were first steps, brilliant improvisation, yes, but not really achieved according to what came to be seen as Lenin's principles of an organized party. The party was marginal until the last 2 months before October. And Lenin was not widely known, and as I said, leadership was very difficult for Lenin to be a leader. Secondly, I think if I have a few more minutes, I think I'd like to point out that Lenin attempted 3 transition models, because the key problem for any socialist is how do you, I mean, it's very easy to say, criticize today's society. It's very easy to describe the future society, but what do you do today? What do you do tomorrow? How do you start moving from one to the other? This was the question which Lenin and others puzzled over. And Lenin had 3 attempts. First of all was the one which was encapsulated in State and Revolution, simplified in the April thesis, which I think is an absolutely crucial document, where he said that well, basically, we just leave it to the people. They're very sensible. They can sort things out for themselves. We'll supervise capitalism. And I think people have underestimated some of the phrases which are deeply entrenched in April thesis. It's not our immediate task to introduce socialism. he says. But what the hell is it? What the hell is their immediate their big task? It was not to introduce socialism. It obviously implies some degree of survival of the market and of capitalism, as he says, under Soviet supervision, by which he means not party supervision. He romantically idealizes the idea of the people themselves supervising capitalism through Soviet institutions. Leninist skeptics would say that was just pie in the sky for the masses. He didn't believe it. I'll leave you to decide on that one. I think, in a sense, Lenin had this degree of naivety, which people tend not to associate naivety with Lenin, but I do think that was part of what his makeup was. Secondly, by spring 1918, that model had failed. The people had failed to start building socialism for themselves. Strikes were being conducted against the party as much as for it, and there was a crisis. And Lenin turns then, again oversimplifying, in I think what's probably his most underread work, but one of his absolutely most important, which is immediate tasks of the Soviet government from April 1918. In immediate tasks, he moves from the idea of a kind of spontaneous people-based revolution to what he calls dictatorship. He uses the term really for the first time, the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat and a proletarian, iron proletarian discipline. He says rather worryingly, so far our approach has resembled jelly rather than iron. In other words, we need a new, much harder, centralized push towards building socialism. And this becomes a model for socialism in one country. Again, not time to go into the full implications of that, but I have written about it, in which he argues that the most important thing at the moment is for the Russian Revolution to survive. We should not listen to the siren voices of the left communists who want us to spread revolutionary war to Western Europe. We must husband our own resources. We must develop ourselves. And the best thing we can do for the Western proletariat is just to survive. And as he says, even retreat to the Urals. The Urals. So for Lenin, socialism in one country becomes crucial, and it is obviously a major influence on Stalin, who was very close to him, very close to working with him at this point. And when people kind of draw a kind of contradictory line between Stalin's socialism in one country and Lenin, they forget that there is a kind of Leninist socialism in one country as well as other aspects of Lenin, because as we know, that harsh transition also collapsed and failed, because part of it particularly involved, because of the general situation, armed requisitioning from the peasants and the peasant rebellion against the Bolsheviks in 1920. I have argued that, and I think I would stand by it, that the civil war, rather than undermining the Bolsheviks, actually enabled them to survive, because they became the leaders of everybody who didn't want the whites back. And many people who were not Bolsheviks fought hard and courageously for a revolution which they wanted to retain, without necessarily being supporters of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Left to themselves, the Bolsheviks, it seemed to me, were in many ways on the skids by 1918. We don't tend to look very much at 1918. But if 1918 had not, I mean, Lenin thought at the time of immediate tasks that the Civil War was basically over. Had it not restarted with the Czech revolt in June, July 1918, who knows what might have happened. There's many implications there, but by 1920, the countryside was in revolt. The workers were complaining about the harshness of their lives, the collapse of industries. Russia was in a terrible state. You have the iconic and tragic rebellion of the Kronstadt sailors, the very heart of the 1917 revolution, the people who were absolutely crucial in making the October Revolution. And they don't turn against the revolution, they turn to the revolution. They turn to the principles of 1917, but apply them against what has happened with Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership. They want Soviets. There's a kind of fake news that they called for Soviets without communists. They did not call for Soviets without communists. They didn't ban the Communist Party. They suggested that the communists should not have special advantages in society in order to enable them to win power and to retain power. So that led to the third transition, the new economic policy, NEP. And that was the one, of course, which Lenin idealized in his last writings in On Cooperation. We've now found all that is really necessary for the transition to socialism. We found a way of combining public interest with private interest, a way with combining socialist construction with individual enterprise. Unfortunately, as the 20s evolved, it turns out that they hadn't. And NEP collapses as well in its turn. Now, we could argue that's way beyond our call for discussion today. But Lenin, all three of Lenin's transition models had really failed. So, just to finish, a couple of other very brief points to make. First of all, Bolshevism should really be understood in the nature of Bolshevik dictatorship. There's a kind of crudity about a lot of discussion in mainstream media, in press, in ordinary discourse. Dictatorships are dictatorship. All dictatorships are the same. Dictatorships can be many different things. What the Bolshevik dictatorship is, in my view, is Lenin's dictatorship. I'm not quite sure how he dictates, by the way. In his book, James Ryan says Lenin's not a dictator. He doesn't go around like your former leader, Mussolini, banging on drums and strutting down streets and making what's the word? Anyway, making kind of speeches off the cuff, of bombastic speeches and all the rest of it. Nothing like that. But he was the one who made the decisions at the end of the day within the cabinet. But in fact, it's more like Lenin's dictatorship is more like the dictatorship of any prime minister in Britain, except he doesn't have to face elections every so often. Perhaps if he had, he'd be facing might at one point have been facing the disaster, which happily he's facing in a conservative government at last, I hope. But the nature of his dictatorship, was that Bolshevik dictatorship is a mobilizing dictatorship. They're building towards a vision of the future. They're trying to attract people onto the bandwagon of future construction. It's not about seizing resources. It's not about power for its own sake. It's about using power to build a utopian society. And in that sense, it's more comparable to, I don't want to push this too far, but we have Islamic fundamentalisms these days, which are geared, theoretically at least, towards exactly the same thing of building towards an ideal future. And as such, cultural revolution in the Bolshevik case is not a kind of add-on. It's absolutely the central point of Leninist thinking, that people are going to be transformed into socialists, and they're going to build on socialist culture. They're going to adopt socialist values. So cultural revolution was not intended to be a kind of nice luxury add-on product on top of all the hard economic and political decisions. It was intended to be the very thing itself. And very finally, the two things which came out most strongly to me in looking at Lenin's influence when I wrote Lenin Lives, which I've emphasized in the book, is that what are often thought of as the Leninist features, as we've already mentioned, particularly the role of the party. Most people, when they talk about Lenin, think of a particular party structure. But what drew people towards Leninism, remember the Stalinist version of Leninism as it would have been for them in the 1920s and the 1930s, was two things. First, they were the only game in town for anti-imperialists. And people like Ho Chi Minh are very good on this. He, of course, was floating around in Europe in the latter years of the First World War. He was in Paris. He joined the French Communist Party early on because they were the least racist and the least imperialist of all the parties, including as some of the members of the French Socialist Party. So anti-imperialism has always been one of the strongest points in attracting people to Leninism and communism, and the same was true of China. The attraction of the formation of the Chinese Communist Party similarly was basically number one, anti-imperialism, number two, Marxism, if you like, but Marxism and Leninism as a means towards anti-imperialism. And finally, most obviously, as the threat developed in the 1920s, the 1930s, communism became, again, the only apparently reliable bulwark against fascism. So anybody who's anti-fascist was drawn to Leninism. And Leninism, communism had its most prestigious moments in Britain, for instance, where it's always been a very marginal thing, really. In the mid-1930s, the time of the Spanish Civil War, when the communists appeared to be on the right side, and during the Second World War, where communism became the backbone of so many resistance movements, when others had failed to do so. So key elements like the disciplined Revolutionary Party tended to evolve, I think, once communism was in power, rather than anything that led them to power. Okay, well, I have maintained a monopoly of this discussion so far well enough. I'd be very happy to hear a few comments and questions and refutations and queries. So thank you very much for being so kind to listen. Thank you.